You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Schatten. Before we get started with today's guest, just a note, if you have questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it. Today's guest on the podcast is Vinay Shandal. He's a partner and managing director at the Boston Consulting Group. Shandal is the head of the Canadian Principal Investors and Private Equity practice and helps to lead Boston Consulting Group's efforts on the shareholder activism topic as a core member of the corporate development practice area. Vinay Shandal has extensive experience in private and public company mergers, acquisitions, strategic alliances, and investments in a range of industries. And he has one of the most compelling TED Talks that you can find. As you will see, our spirited conversation covers a wide range of topics that center on the role of shareholder activism. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Vinay Shandal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Jeff.
So you've done a lot of work about the relationship between corporations and their investors, and you have an excellent TED Talk, which I recommend that everybody check out. That's really looking at the role of activist investors turning their attention from just profit maximization to having a larger social impact. So I thought we'd start. Just give me an overall thesis of your basic ideas of the relationship between investors and the corporation.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and there's multiple levels to it, and hopefully we can kind of unpack it today. But at its core, the thesis is that historically shareholders would invest in companies because they thought the companies would appreciate in value and pay off dividends, and through that appreciation in value and payment of dividends, they would make a financial return and be happy, and that would be the end of the story. And that anything that had to do with public policies, so environmental issues or social issues, was the domain of the not-for-profit sector or the public sector, and that investors had very little to do, and frankly, corporations had very little to do in that area. What's
right? So this is the Milton Friedman perspective of the world, right? That the only role of a corporation is to return capital to its shareholders, nothing more, nothing less, as long as it's legal.
Yep. And what's interesting is I think if you look at how people define the fiduciary duty in the U.S. versus in other common law markets, I think in the U.S. it's called the board has a responsibility to look out for, I think it's the best interest of the shareholders. Whereas in I know at least in Canada and other markets, it's the best interest of the corporation. And what's interesting there is the corporation has been defined in some markets as including stakeholders that go beyond the shareholders, so employees and the broader community, which is actually quite interesting. But the core of my thesis is that, the lines have blurred, and corporations certainly have, through the work that they do, through the products that they sell and the services that they render, have an impact on the community. And that if they were to minimize the harm, or actually, put more positively, do good for society or stakeholders more broadly, that does not run counter to the profit maximization objective that corporations have. And there's this belief, there's been this long held belief that if I, as a corporate manager, do stuff for the community, so do things in a way that's less harmful to the environment, or do things in a way that promotes more inclusive practices or better business practices, that might come at the expense of shareholder value. What a lot of studies have found, including some that BCG recently did, is that actually that's not true. That there is a correlation between the two. In other words, if a corporation and its managers do good for the environment or do good for society, in doing so, they could actually drive better profits for the business and therefore more value for the shareholder. So to get to your question, Jeff, the thesis is that given that's true, and given that a lot of public sector actors and not-for-profit actors have not been able to address a lot of the social issues, we have a very unique opportunity for shareholders, especially concentrated shareholders, so large shareholders, to push management teams to do both, drive social good while also driving better bottom line results.
So I want to pull in some ideas from the negotiation literature, which is one of the things that often happens with decision making is that people get into what we call the fixed pie myth, which is that if I'm working with a counterpart, let's say I'm negotiating a deal, most people have this illusion that it's either I win and they lose, or they win and I lose. And this kind of connects to some of the things that you're talking about, where you can have joint, what we call in negotiation, joint gains, where you can expand the pie and it's better for everybody instead of viewing everything that's, for example, in the larger corporate governance question, everything that's good for the environment is inherently going to be bad for my company because it's $1 for the environment versus $1 for my company.
I think that's well said. I've never thought of it from that lens. I think there's definitely a nice parallel there, and I think that's a great way of thinking about it.
So I want to just now kind of dig into what I see as some of the challenges of some of the issues that come up with conscious capitalism and more of the stakeholder theory. The idea is right that you would have multiple interests, not just bottom line interests. So the first one is how do you coordinate the interests of millions of people? So let me just kind of get into this. So let's say I'm the 100% owner of a company. Or my family is 100% owner of a company. It's really easy for me to push other interests other than the bottom line. Never mind what you think of them. Chick-fil-A, for example, has decided that their interest is to uphold religious values, keep their stores closed on Sunday. So it's really easy for them to coordinate that, even though it's most likely at the expense of some bottom line considerations. How do you coordinate that amongst millions of shareholders who have really varying interests beyond just a simple profit maximization point?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Jeff, and you're getting to the heart of it, which is, I actually believe that it's not the role of shareholders to affect public policy, and I think that's actually there's a real slippery slope here. Because those that we've entrusted with, at least in organized participatory countries where the governance allows for public participation in elections or having a say in public policy.
No, but I mean, sorry, let me clarify. I mean that you have 1 million investors right now in Apple, right? There's millions of people that. Okay.
Yeah, the question is here, Jeff. Here's where I'm going with this. I don't think this is about canvassing the views of all the shareholders and then using the fact that they happen to have equity in the business to help management of Apple say we're pro-diversity, we're anti-environment, and we're anti-child labor. Like, I don't think that's the way to think about it. And I think the risk is that and where I'm going is absent measurement, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but absent measurement, the real risk is that whomever a pension fund or an institutional investor has entrusted with ESG is actually...
So explain ESG.
Yeah. So it stands for environmental, social, and governance issues, which is basically an acronym that encompasses all of the social, environmental, board governance, diversity, etc. topics that a management team and its shareholders, deal with. But look, the risk with my thesis, and let me just put this out there, the risk with the thesis I advance in my TED Talk is the following. Taken to its extreme, individuals who are entrusted with pushing the ESG agenda in the companies in which their employer has equity. So, for example, if I work for a big state pension fund in the US and my company, my pension fund is a big shareholder in say it was Chick-fil-A, and it was a company that wasn't exclusively owned by the family, I would be sitting there saying, okay, I have this mandate. My job is to go in and talk to management about environmental, social, and governance issues. And gosh, I'm not sure which ones I need to push, but I'm a huge fan of diversity and inclusion, so I'm going to go and push diversity and inclusion. And if you just kind of stop there, that on its face is not, offensive to many people. I think, people are generally supportive of corporate policies that promote diversity and inclusion. The issue is that you take that to its logical conclusion. There's really no clarity on what issues I should be pushing and what issues I shouldn't. And a piece that I'm working on right now really harps on the fact that what we desperately need in this space is measurement and greater proof of the correlation. At the end of the day, if I work for a pension fund, my job is to manage the money on behalf of people who are relying on me to make sure that when they retire, we can pay their pensions. And as a result, and this is the correlation point, given in a given sector, so take pharma or take retail or take media, in each sector, what we've found is that there are certain social and environmental policies that if a company adopts, in adopting them, it will enjoy better financial returns. And so the check and the balance, to your question about there's millions of shareholders, I think the check and the balance or the deciding factor needs to be, okay, you're a million shareholders in Apple. Apple is it's a technology company broadly. And in a technology company, here are the 2 or 3 things that fall into the bucket of ESG, so environmental, social, and governance, that if they were in place would drive greater financial returns. And if frankly, doing stuff in the local community for the environment has nothing to do with financial returns for Apple, if management wants to go off and do that because that's something that they think will, drive better employee engagement or is just the right thing to do, more power to them. But as a shareholder, you don't really have a leg to stand on in pushing Apple to do a cleanup of the local parks, because your job as a shareholder, especially when you're managing the money on behalf of others, is to manage the money on behalf of the others. And
so it's really interesting. So you're really looking for this bullseye where you get the cross return and the cross social impact. And what you're saying is, absent that social impact, that pension funds should not be pushing it. Absent the financial returns, the pension fund should not be pushing the social impact.
Correct, because this starts to really creep into public policy issues, and I worry about, just given how polarized the politics are in your country and increasingly in mine. I'm a Canadian. I worry about what we have is a couple of trends that worry me. One is we have an increasing amount of capital concentrated in fewer hands. So large institutional investors, large pension funds are managing an increasing amount of the public's money. And, corporations and management teams were never meant to be the vehicle through which the public would push public policy. Public policy should be pushed from the public sector. And what I worry about is, if the pension fund is doing stuff that I'm generally okay with, I'm all for diversity and inclusion, great. But what if that pension fund is now managed by a group that has some pretty extreme views that are not widely held and that are, the antithesis of what most people think is right, suddenly you're left in a position where you don't have much recourse against those managing your money. And there's a whole bunch of things that they could be pushing management teams to, they could be pushing management teams to do a bunch of stuff that's not going to fly in the face of financial returns, but certainly won't increase them. And therefore really have nothing to do with the job they've been asked to do, which is manage the money.
Right.
And so, and your point, I mean, the point you had about, the ownership of Chick-fil-A, I mean, I think the one area where there is really no opportunity for oversight is large privately owned companies. End of the day, there's absent, outside of whatever is legal and illegal, an owner of a private company can push the company to do whatever he or she wants. As long as they're within the confines of the law, they can have, pretty regressive policies around issues of diversity. They can pretty much operate in disregard of the environment, again, provided they're within the bounds of the law, etc. And so the starting point is, I, as an owner of a company, can act pretty much in disregard of all these issues, provided I'm not breaking the law. And even if it means compromising financial returns, I can personally be cool with it because that's my own view. But once
I want to so I want to jump in with just to discuss what currently exists. So there are a bunch of funds out there, both ETFs, mutual funds, pension funds that consider them a part of the ESG movement, that consider themselves socially oriented funds. And I just thought I'd just bring up one of them, just so that we can have a conversation about what is the norm and what is the bar that exists right now. So Vanguard currently has an ETF, and I'm just picking on Vanguard, but they're all pretty much similar to this. So they have a socially oriented ETF, and they have a bunch of holdings, and it's large cap oriented, and it's they're competing with the S&P 500. And when you look at what they have, right, what's sitting in their socially conscious fund, it's Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon. It also includes, maybe some more questionable ones like Coke, McDonald's. It has Facebook, Nike, Phillips 66, so even some energy exposure. And when I look down at what they're holding, it's pretty much everything aside from big tobacco and aside from firearms. And that tends to be what we see out there, right? Because they're these are enormous funds. They're trying to compete with the broader market, and the truth is that they hold much of the market. And if we were just to pick on one thing, right, what is Vanguard going to do about Facebook and its current issues, or Nike and child labor, or McDonald's and health questions? So I just wanted to bring up just the kind of the role of these massive funds that are branding themselves socially conscious, but really hold just everything aside from a couple different areas.
Yep. So let me say a couple of things. One is, let's talk about the spectrum. I think, kind of imagine the spectrum, left to right. On the extreme left, you've got the bare minimum, which is I'm an ESG fund and I have what I call negative screening. And what that means is, which is what you described, I screen out the stuff that I have some kind of moral objection to. So, firearm businesses, tobacco businesses, etc. Those are out. The rest of it are in. And maybe on the margins, I'll kick some out if in a given sector, they're behind on ESG issues. So if within retail banking, this one is not doing enough for financial inclusion or financial education, then I'll kick that bank out and the rest can stay. And so what you would have is something very much along the lines of you described, which is like just a bunch of big corporations that I don't really think of when I think of doing a lot of good for society, but they're in the ETF and that's great. The next one then is a more of what I call positive screening, which is I actually single out companies that in their peer group, so versus kicking a couple out, I proactively pick the leaders in their sector. So the Patagonias of the world, the Toms of the world. So the organizations that are really going out there and not just doing CPG or retail like everybody else, but really focusing on channeling money back into the community, on using sustainable supply chain practices, really great labor practices, etc. Right? So that's what I call positive. But in both cases, I'm just holding. I'm owning the stock on behalf of my investors. The third bucket is what you touched on, Jeff, which is what I've got a ton of passion for, is this whole issue of engagement. Now that I own these companies and I own a big enough chunk that management will take a meeting with me, what am I going to do? And this is
the activist investor model.
Exactly.
Right. This is taking kind of the Carl Icahn and Bill Ackman approach of the universe over toward the socially oriented funds.
100%. And this is where the slippery slope argument that I was advancing at the top of this conversation really kicks in, which is in figuring out what I'm going to do. And by what I'm going to do, well, let me just be very clear when we talk about what we mean by activism. What we mean is going in to management's office and saying, I need you to do X. I need you to change your supply chain so that you're using more sustainable practices. You're hurting the environment less in how you get goods from point A to point B. And here's specifically how I think you can do it. And if you don't do it, there's going to be consequences. That's what I mean by engaging. This is where we have to be very careful, because absent some kind of governance that makes sure that the shareholder, especially the shareholder who's showing up on behalf of other shareholders, so like a Vanguard, for example, it's not Vanguard's own money, it's the money of a bunch of other people who have entrusted Vanguard with their money. As long as Vanguard is pushing issues that have a clear correlation to financial returns, we call these material ESG factors, as long as they're pushing those, I think it's fine. Once they start pushing issues that have nothing to do with financial returns, you start delegating public policy to a few money managers who just happen to be in this privileged position of managing money on behalf of a whole bunch of people. And that's where it gets risky.
Yeah, and I think part of the question is, where do you end up drawing lines? I mean, does VW cross the line? Wells Fargo, Facebook, Exxon? Just think of Exxon, right? I mean, Exxon is in fossil fuels. Exxon is also one of the leading companies in research and development for alternative energies. So, how does any manager ever draw lines on these companies?
Yeah, so I have a hard time. I mean, we're going to separate two things. One is what sector you're in. And we can't just paint an entire sector like oil and gas with a negative brush and say, you're in a sector that is that's got a heavier carbon footprint than some others, so we don't like you. I think what's exciting in that sector is all the innovation that's being done by some of the leaders to think about what is that energy transition going to look like? What is all the R&D we need to be doing in renewables? End of the day, those are going to be important questions, and these companies have the resources.
The top innovation is going to come from an Exxon or from a BP.
I agree. So I don't have a lot of tolerance for people who are picketing those companies and saying, you must fail and you must go bankrupt and you must stop doing business, because end of the day, they're very incented to figure out what that next innovation will be. So that's them. Then I think there is, once you've gotten past the sector hurdle, figuring out what to do. So look, I mean, take Apple. Apple's a great example. I mean, screen time. I think everybody who's got an iPhone has seen the little screen time thing show up telling you, how much of your time you spent on the smartphone and how does it break down from productive use to unproductive use to whatever. And that's there thanks to a shareholder. JANA Partners went in and agitated because of the addictive nature of smartphones, and Apple, based on that and a bunch of other research and input, has been slowly working on figuring out ways to put some guardrails on how the phones get used and who they get used by and how much they get used. And so, this is where a lot of work, we're at the early innings of this, Jeff. A lot of smart people are putting a lot of energy into what are those things that a JANA or a Vanguard or a BlackRock should be pushing that are appropriate for them to push. Appropriate because they're issues that have something to do with shareholder value, as opposed to I'm pushing it because I have a political leaning in this favor and this lines up with my political values, but has nothing to do with making some money for my shareholders who are depending on it for their retirements and for their savings.
I want to talk a little bit about divestiture, and you might feel free to completely disagree with me on this. But for most companies, if you simply divest from a company, very little happens because capital will flow to it. So, for example, if you decide, if one particular fund decides not to invest and let's just stick with Exxon for whatever reason, capital from around the globe will fill in that void. Their capital is like water. It will go to the lowest point. If there are returns to be made, other capital will fill that void. In contrast, the more active type of capital is the one that can usually create the change. So I think of what I think of is actually what many might consider a crazy example would be you're unlikely to create that much change by taking out investments out of Smith and Wesson and one of the top gun manufacturers, but you're more likely to be able to make change in Smith and Wesson by owning a bunch of their shares and going in and demanding change about gun safety. And that divestiture only has so much of an effect just because there's so much capital out there, and capital will find its returns.
Yeah, look, Jeff, I applaud you for saying that because it's going to make you very unpopular on campus. I think a lot of protests we've seen from well-organized groups is around pushing investors to divest, and I have very little tolerance for that argument. I think because I fully agree with what you just said. A great example and a very recent one is a large Canadian pension fund had exposure to a U.S. private prison, and people here in Canada were getting very worked up about how the narrative, and it's a great media headline. How dare this pension fund manager invest the money of wonderful Canadians in an institution or an entity that profits from the horrible policies of the Trump administration. What a great headline, and probably catchier than the way I've articulated it. But that was basically the big buzz, and people were lining up in front of this pension fund's front door. Tons of media, our left-leaning political party was up in arms about this. And end of the day, I wish they'd had a chance to speak with you, because what you would have told them was, look, who would you rather own that U.S. private prison? An organization that actually cares about the rights of inmates and will push management to make sure that they're treating inmates appropriately, versus a bunch of investors from different parts of the world who, frankly, in their own markets, have a terrible track record of human rights abuses among inmate populations, and would be very happy to turn a blind eye to some of the atrocities that we're reading about. And look, this is one example, but there's been, and I talk about this in my TED Talk, there's been a series of high-profile divestitures from private prison stock in the U.S. Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, and then maybe a dozen others over the last, call it 5 years, or 5 to 10 years. And over that decade, the value of private prison stock in the U.S. has actually tracked, and I think in some cases beat the S&P 500, which is the average of the large companies in the U.S.
So here's the issue, right? Is that if you really, given that there's 50 or 100 trillion dollars out there chasing gains, and that is just not going to change, much of the way that a company can have significant change in terms of how it affects society is going to come from within. It's going to come from better management. It's going to come from better values. It's going to come from a better corporate culture. And divestiture is a tool, but it's a very limited and weak tool. And the stronger tool is going to come from pressure from internal shareholders.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly true in this day and age, where we've seen a real lack of leadership in the public sector.
So what do you see going forward? Like in terms of what can realistically be done about this relationship between our largest shareholders of pension funds and the Vanguards and the BlackRocks of the world, and the companies that they own or represent. How do you see that relationship moving forward?
Yeah, no, look, I think there's a bunch of trends that I'm super excited about, and there's a couple of watchouts. I think the things I'm most excited about are the fact that this conversation about creating social impact through the private sector is no longer some niche topic that a few people are having small meetings about in some dark conference room. This has become a very mainstream topic. It's top of mind for CEOs of companies. It's top of mind for leading money managers. So that's number one. It's become a big topic that's getting tons of attention, which is a trend that I like. Another trend that I like is that capital is increasingly beginning to get concentrated. Concentration of capital is helpful. If you have millions of shareholders owning Apple, no single shareholder has a voice. And it's very hard. And there's organizations that try, but it's very hard to get those shareholders organized to engage with management. The fact that we're having money concentrated in fewer hands, so large institutional investors and pension funds and others, that some of which we've named today, that's another great trend. And the third is that there's a ton of research being done on what are the specific ESG levers, environmental, social, and governance levers or topics that we should be pushing in a given industry vertical that's going to both help society and help the bottom line of the business. My biggest watch out is that work is hard. It's going to take time. It's slow to progress. And what I mean by that work is that piece around which levers are going to both help society and the company. And because that work is slow to progress, there's a real risk that people start pushing issues that have nothing to do with financial returns. And it really puts into question what we're doing in this whole area and puts into question whether shareholders managing money on behalf of other people should be pushing this ESG agenda at all. And that worries me.
Yeah, I think your overall thesis is really really astute. This idea of finding that mix of returns for investors that cross over with financial returns is a really good one. I want to just kind of close out our conversation with a discussion about leadership and culture, and that so much of what you're talking about. You're saying you're trying to find correlations between returns and values effectively, or returns on the ESG issues. And much of this comes down to corporate culture. This is now getting into much more into my area of organizational behavior. But I would also want to see studies on how culture is run and how values are going down the line into employee behavior, and then if that's a large driver of your returns. What do you think about kind of this discussion about leadership and values versus the overall returns of companies?
So I think, let me make sure I got your question, Jeff. Are you asking, putting aside the impact, the correlation between ESG and financial returns, you're talking about?
I'm talking about that much of ESG, that much of that is driven by corporate values. Yeah. By much of that is that there's a value structure in place. It's not just a top-down phenomenon.
Yeah. No, I love where you're going. I think what many of our clients in my consulting practice recognize and appreciate is that an engaged workforce, a workforce that's excited to come in to work every day, is going to be far more productive, have better speed to outcome, have lower attrition, meaning they'll stay in the job longer versus looking for their next gig 6 months into being hired. And all those things contribute to the bottom line. Now, the question that we've got to ask is how much of that employee engagement and productivity is driven by really great corporate values versus a plethora of other things that companies are experimenting with, everything from agile ways of working, really cool workspace, well-stocked snacks in the lounge, corporate outings, empowerment of the staff to make decisions versus being micromanaged, etc. All these things, I believe, have a role to play. But I think values certainly do. I think the younger generation, in fact, I think there was a recent Stanford survey on this that showed that a lot of the people coming out of business school these days would accept lower pay to work for a company that had real values, that really stood for something, that had a purpose. And Larry Fink talks a lot about the importance now of companies discovering their purpose, because that purpose translates into a set of values that then trickle down to the staff. And people come into work and they feel that what they're doing is contributing to something that's bigger than, just the bottom line and their own paycheck, but that it's in some way helping move society forward. So I think you're onto something very exciting there.
All right. Well, we're about out of time. I want to thank Vinay Shandal for showing up for the podcast. This is an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it, and this is you're participating in an engaging and an exciting space.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.